James Carter was the kind of man people noticed but never really saw. He walked into the auto shop every morning before sunrise, carrying a small metal toolbox that looked older than most of the workers there. The box had scratches and faded, stickers, each mark holding a story from a time no one cared to ask about. To the younger mechanics, he was just old Jim, the quiet man who worked slowly and didn't talk much. But what they didn't know was that every tool in that box had once been part of something far greater than an oil change or a flat tire. Jim had spent most of his life serving his country. He had worked on helicopters in dangerous zones, often under fire, keeping those flying machines alive so pilots could return home safely. But he never spoke of that time. He never mentioned the medals or the nights he worked without sleep. For him, the past was something to carry silently, like the toolbox that had followed him everywhere for 40 years. That morning was like any other. The sun had just started to rise, painting the shop in a soft, golden light. Jim parked his old truck in the back and walked toward his usual corner. But as soon as he stepped inside, something felt different. The place was cleaner, emptier somehow. The workbench where he always kept his box was bare. His tools, his life's work, were gone. He looked around, confused. "Hey, Mike," he said to the new supervisor, a man who barely looked old enough to shave. "You seen my toolbox?" Mike didn't even look up from his phone. "Oh, that old rusty thing? We cleaned it out last night. The boss said we needed the space. You can grab whatever's left out back before the garbage truck comes." For a second, Jim just stood there, trying to process what he'd heard. His heart sank as he turned and walked toward the back door. The moment he stepped outside, his chest tightened. There it was, his old metal box, tossed beside the trash bins like a pile of broken parts. The lid was open, and a few of his wrenches were scattered on the ground, still covered in the grease from his last repair. He bent down slowly, his knees aching, and picked up a screwdriver. It was one of the first tools he had used during his military years. He could still remember fixing a helicopter rotor with it in the middle of a sandstorm, saving a pilot who'd been trapped miles from base. That same tool now lay covered in dust near an empty soda can. Behind him, a few of the younger workers laughed, not cruelly, but with the kind of thoughtless laughter that comes from not knowing what something means. "Guess it was time for a new set, huh, Jim?" one of them said. Jim didn't answer. He just nodded softly and kept gathering the scattered tools. His hands didn't shake. His face didn't show anger. But deep down, it felt like someone had erased a part of his story. When he was done, he closed the box and brushed the dirt off its surface. The metal felt cold, heavier than usual, as if it too carried the weight of what had just happened. He looked at the shop one last time, the place that had been like a second home since he retired from service, and then walked toward his truck. The sound of laughter faded behind him as he opened the door and placed the box carefully on the passenger seat. He sat there for a while, staring at the steering wheel. Memories came rushing back, faces of the men he'd worked with, the roar of helicopter blades, the smell of burning fuel mixed with rain. They had trusted him with their lives. Every bolt he tightened, every part he replaced had meant survival. And now, those same hands weren't even trusted to keep a toolbox in a garage. As he started the truck and drove off, the streets of the small town seemed quieter than usual. The morning air felt heavy. He passed by the diner where he used to meet a few old friends, all veterans like him. Most of them had moved away or passed on. Sometimes he wondered if anyone remembered the things they had done, if the world still cared. Jim drove to a nearby park and parked under a large oak tree. He opened the toolbox and looked inside. A few tools were still missing, but the important ones were there. The wrench engraved with his initials, the small hammer wrapped in old tape, and the screwdriver with the worn handle. He wiped each tool carefully as if saying thank you for staying with him through everything. A child walked by with his father and pointed at the toolbox. "That looks really old," the boy said. His father smiled and nodded. "Tools like those built more than cars, son. They built courage." Jim smiled faintly. It was the first kind word he had heard all day. He sat there until the sun was high, then closed the box and locked it. He didn't know what he would do next. But he knew he wouldn't forget this day. He had been disrespected before, but something about seeing his tools in the trash hit him deeper. Maybe it was the realization that the world had moved on, that people no longer looked beyond what they could see. As he drove home, he didn't notice the car following him slowly, a dark SUV with tinted windows. Inside sat a man in uniform, one who had recognized Jim's name from the shop's employee list. He had served under him years ago, during missions most people would never hear about. That man made a quiet phone call that would change everything the next day. But for now, Jim drove on in silence, unaware of what was coming. The afternoon light shimmered across the metal of his old toolbox. It sat safely beside him, a reminder of who he truly was. He might have been thrown aside by people who didn't understand, but his story wasn't over. Far from it. Something was already in motion, something that would make the whole town remember the man they had once overlooked. And as he turned onto the dirt road toward his small farmhouse, a gentle smile appeared on his face. "It's just a box," he whispered softly. "But it's been through more than most men ever will." The sound of distant rotor blades echoed faintly in the sky above, though he didn't notice it yet. The next day would prove that no matter how much time passes, true respect can never be thrown away. The next morning began quietly, but there was a strange feeling in the air. The small town usually woke up slow, with the smell of coffee drifting out of cafes and the sound of cars passing by on their way to work. But that day something felt different, like a secret was waiting to unfold. At the auto shop, the workers were busy as usual. They joked, worked on cars, and didn't think twice about what had happened the day before. Most of them assumed that old Jim had just gone home for good, but a few people in town had seen what happened behind the shop, how that old veteran's toolbox was tossed beside the trash. One of them was Mr. Dawson, the owner of a nearby hardware store. He had known Jim for years, though Jim never talked much about his past. That night, Dawson looked through some old records and found a photo in a frame behind the counter, a picture of a young mechanic in uniform standing beside a helicopter. The name under it read Sergeant Major James Carter. Dawson remembered then. He remembered the stories people once whispered about a brave helicopter technician who saved lives during missions no one else could reach. He made a few phone calls, unsure if anyone would even listen. But within a few hours, his call reached someone who knew that name very well, Colonel Richard Hayes, a man who had once served under Jim's guidance. The moment Hayes heard what had happened, he went silent. Then he gave a short order to the person on the line. "Find that man. We owe him more than words." By late morning, a line of black SUVs rolled into the small town. People peeked through their windows, wondering what was going on. The cars stopped right in front of the same auto shop that had thrown away Jim's toolbox. A few men in uniform stepped out, their badges shining in the sunlight. The sound of their boots on the pavement echoed, catching everyone's attention. Inside the shop, the workers froze. The supervisor, Mike, hurried out, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, trying to sound confident. One of the men handed him a piece of paper with a name written on it. "We're looking for James Carter. We were told he worked here." Mike looked confused, then shrugged. "Oh, that old guy?"
"Yeah, he was here, but he quit yesterday."
Something about his toolbox. "You guys know him?" The man's eyes narrowed. "Yes," he said firmly. "We know him very well." Before anyone could ask more, a deep rumbling sound filled the air. It started faintly like thunder far away, then grew louder and louder. People stepped outside, shading their eyes as the sound grew into a roar. Children pointed toward the sky as a large military helicopter appeared above the town. Its rotors whipped the air, sending dust and leaves flying everywhere. The whole town stopped to watch. The helicopter circled once, then began to descend right into the parking lot of the auto shop. The wind from the blade sent papers flying, rattled car hoods, and made everyone back away. When it finally touched down, the noise was deafening. The shop workers stood frozen, disbelief written on their faces. The side door of the helicopter opened, and a tall man in a decorated uniform stepped out. It was Colonel Hayes. His expression was serious, his eyes scanning the crowd until they stopped on a familiar figure standing by the road. Jim Carter, holding his old toolbox in one hand. Jim had driven into town that morning to pick up a part for his truck. He never expected to see a helicopter landing near the very place that had humiliated him just a day ago. He stood still, confused, as the colonel approached him with a firm step. When the colonel stopped in front of him, he straightened his back and saluted sharply. "Sergeant Major Carter," he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "It's an honor to stand before you again, sir." The crowd fell silent. Even the workers who had laughed at Jim the day before didn't move. Jim looked at the colonel, his eyes wide with surprise. "Colonel Hayes?" he said softly, recognizing the man. "What are you doing here?" The colonel smiled slightly, returning something that should never have been thrown away. He turned and gestured toward the helicopter. Two soldiers stepped out and carefully took Jim's old toolbox from his hands. They carried it as if it were something sacred, setting it gently inside the helicopter's storage bay. Mike, the supervisor, stammered, "Wait, who is he?" Hayes turned toward him. "He's the man who kept our aircraft in the sky when everything else was falling apart. The man whose steady hands saved more pilots than you could count. The tools you threw away built hope in places most people wouldn't dare to go." The words hit hard. No one spoke. The workers lowered their heads, feeling a deep wave of shame. Jim just stood quietly, still trying to understand what was happening. Then the colonel handed him an envelope. "You're being honored at the base this weekend," he said. "We want you there, Sergeant. You deserve it." Jim hesitated, his eyes soft with emotion. "I didn't do all that for recognition," he said. "I know," Hayes replied with a nod. "That's exactly why you deserve it." People from all around the town had gathered by then, drawn by the sound of the helicopter. Some clapped, others simply watched in awe. The sight of soldiers saluting an old mechanic touched something deep in everyone's hearts. Jim felt the weight of years lift from his shoulders. For so long he had carried his past quietly, believing no one cared. But in that moment, as the colonel saluted him and the town stood still, he realized something powerful. Respect never truly disappears. It might be forgotten for a time, but it always finds its way back. The colonel turned to leave, but before stepping into the helicopter, he looked at Jim again and said, "We'll see you at the ceremony, sir." The rotor blades started turning again, kicking up wind and dust. As the helicopter rose into the sky, the sunlight caught the metal surface of Jim's old toolbox, now safe inside. The people in the parking lot watched until it disappeared into the clouds. No one spoke for a long while. Then one of the young mechanics, the same one who had laughed before, walked up to Jim. "I'm sorry, Mr. Carter," he said quietly. "I didn't know." Jim smiled gently and patted his shoulder. "That's all right, son. Most people don't know until they learn to look a little deeper." He turned to leave, walking slowly toward his truck. But this time every eye followed him, not with pity, but with respect. The town would talk about that day for years. The day a helicopter landed in the parking lot, not for a rescue mission, but for a man who had once kept them flying. Jim drove home in silence, the wind from the open window brushing against his face. He looked up at the sky, watching a distant speck of the helicopter fading into the blue. For the first time in years, his heart felt full. The world had remembered him, not as a mechanic, not as an old man, but as the hero he had quietly been all along. The day of the ceremony arrived with a clear blue sky. The morning air carried a soft breeze, and the base was filled with quiet excitement. Soldiers were moving about. Flags waved gently in the air, and rows of chairs were neatly set up in front of a small stage. At the center of it all was an empty seat, with a name card that read, "Sergeant Major James Carter, retired." Jim drove toward the base in his old pickup truck, his heart beating a little faster than usual. He hadn't been back to a military base in years. The guard at the gate recognized his name on the list and stood straighter before saluting him. "Welcome back, sir," the guard said with a smile. Jim nodded and returned the greeting, a small spark of pride lighting his face. As he parked and stepped out, his eyes wandered across the area. The sight of the hangars, the sound of engines in the distance, and the smell of oil and fuel brought back memories he had buried long ago. He remembered nights spent repairing helicopters under flickering lights, the hum of blades cutting through the air, and the relieved smiles of pilots returning safely because of the work his team had done. Colonel Hayes met him near the entrance, his face lighting up with genuine respect. "I'm glad you came, Sergeant," he said, shaking Jim's hand firmly. "Everyone's been waiting for this day." Jim chuckled softly. "I never thought anyone would wait for me again," he said. The colonel smiled. You'd be surprised how many people remember the man who kept their wings from falling. They walked together toward the stage. The crowd was large. Soldiers, families, veterans, even some people from the town, including Mr. Dawson and a few of the mechanics from the auto shop. When Jim saw them, his eyes softened. He didn't hold anger. He only felt gratitude that they had come. As he sat in his seat, the ceremony began. The announcer spoke about bravery, loyalty, and the unseen heroes who work behind the scenes, the ones who fix, protect, and never ask for thanks. Then the announcer said his name. Today we honor Sergeant Major James Carter, whose skill and dedication saved countless lives. His service reminds us that true heroes don't always wear medals. Sometimes they carry toolboxes. Applause filled the air. Jim looked down, a little embarrassed, but his heart was full. The colonel stepped forward and opened a velvet case. Inside was a special medal shining bright under the sunlight. As he pinned it on Jim's jacket, he said, "You carried others when they could not fly. Today, we carry your name with pride." Jim stood and saluted. The soldiers around him returned the gesture, a sea of hands raised in perfect respect. It was a moment that washed away the loneliness and quiet hurt of all those forgotten years. After the ceremony, people came to shake his hand and thank him. Some shared stories of missions where his quick repairs had saved them. Others simply said they were honored to meet him. Even the young mechanic from the shop approached him again, his voice low with emotion. "Sir, I'll never forget what I saw that day. You taught me more about respect than any book could." Jim smiled kindly. "Just remember, every tool, every hand, every small job matters. You never know what difference it can make." Reporters took pictures and a small news channel recorded the event. By evening, the story of the veteran and his tossed-out toolbox was everywhere, in newspapers, on television, and online. People across the country read about the humble mechanic who had once kept helicopters flying during dangerous missions. The next week, the town honored him too. The parking lot where the helicopter had landed was cleaned and repaired. A shiny new sign was placed at the front that read Veterans Square, in honor of Sergeant Major James Carter. The mayor invited Jim to cut the ribbon. When he did, people clapped and some even had tears in their eyes. Jim didn't say much during the ceremony. When asked to speak, he simply stepped forward and said, "Respect is not about medals or titles. It's about remembering that every person has a story. Some just don't tell theirs out loud." The crowd fell silent, letting his words sink in. From that day on, people saw Jim differently. When he visited the shop, the younger mechanics greeted him with smiles and offered him coffee. They even set aside a corner space just for him, a small bench with his name carved above it. His old toolbox sat proudly on the shelf behind, cleaned, polished, and never touched without his permission. Sometimes after work he would sit there quietly, telling stories about engines and helicopters to anyone who wanted to listen. The young workers listened with real interest, amazed at how much courage could hide behind calm eyes and steady hands. Months later, a letter arrived from the military base. It invited him to take part in a training program for young mechanics who wanted to join the Air Force. They wanted him to teach them the same values he had lived by: patience, discipline, and care for every single part they handled. Jim accepted without hesitation. It felt like coming full circle, like his purpose had found him again. When he taught those young recruits, he didn't talk much about war or danger. Instead, he told them about teamwork and trust. "Every bolt you tighten," he would say, "can mean someone's life. So never rush. Never ignore the little things." His voice carried the weight of experience, and every student listened closely. Years went by, and the legend of the veteran with the tossed-out toolbox became part of the town story. Children learned about him in school, and visitors often came to see the spot where the helicopter had landed. Some even brought their own tools to donate to a display that honored veterans who worked behind the scenes. Jim grew older, but his spirit stayed strong. Every morning he still went to the shop for a little while, then spent the rest of his time mentoring or visiting the base. On quiet evenings, he would sit on his porch, his old toolbox beside him, watching the sunset. Sometimes he could hear a faint sound in the distance, the whir of helicopter blades, and it always made him smile. He never bragged about what happened, and he never spoke badly about the people who had once wronged him. In his heart, he had forgiven them long ago. For him, the real victory wasn't the medal or the fame. It was the change he saw in others, the kindness, the respect, the understanding. One day, a young boy from the town visited him. He was holding a small wrench in his hand. "Mr. Carter," the boy said shyly, "I want to fix things like you when I grow up." Jim smiled warmly and patted his shoulder. "Then start by fixing hearts first, son. The rest will follow." The boy nodded, his eyes wide with admiration. Jim leaned back in his chair, watching the sunset paint the sky in golden light. The world around him had changed, but in that moment he felt peace. His life had come full circle, from the noise of helicopters and engines to the quiet hum of gratitude that filled his days. The toolbox that once sat in the trash was now a symbol of respect and hope. It reminded everyone that even the simplest things, when built with love and purpose, could carry stories worth remembering, and so, the man who was once forgotten became a legend, not because of what he owned, but because of the heart and humility he carried every single day.